Hey everyone, a new episode of Frivolous Science is coming out super soon. I'm so excited to share it with you. But while I finish getting it ready for you all, I have two things to share. One is a little teaser for the upcoming episode.
Is 100 cockroaches, are they worth one chicken, right?
She would play dead for sometimes 6 hours. Like one time I went to class and I got back and she was still playing dead. And I was like, girl, I know you're faking. You're fine.
He had a really great time mucking around with thermoplastic and making little harnesses for the cockroaches.
I started with one. I now have probably a few hundred.
A few hundred? So what are you going to do?
I don't know. I haven't thought that far ahead, but I guess get a bigger tank for them.
If all we did was to improve our health, we would end up all living to be 120, but we'd never do anything interesting. We would never learn anything interesting. We wouldn't better understand the world. And so we'd die and it would be no better than when we entered it.
Yep, it's about cockroaches, their feelings, and the people who deeply care about it. As someone who's literally had nightmares about cockroaches, I seriously feel changed after speaking with these two. You'll meet Dr. Fisher and Marissa in the full episode, where you'll get to hear their cases for thinking a little more deeply about what cockroaches are feeling. The second thing I wanted to put out ahead of the next episode is a new segment that I'm calling Pointless Policies until I can think of a better name. In it, we'll discuss current happenings in science funding with the goal of demystifying how science is funded and understanding the current discussions going on amongst the people in Washington so that we can have a say in it too. For the debut edition, there's been a proposed rule under debate that's super controversial. To help us understand what it is that's being proposed, I brought in Dr. Erica Kimmerling. Dr. Kimmerling is a biomedical engineering PhD and the Senior Director of the Association of Science and Technology Center's Future of Science Strategies, which is part of a nonprofit in DC with a mission of helping people understand and connect with science. We can start with the first question that I have for you, which is, what is this rule that's being proposed by the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, and how does that differ from how science grant funding works now?
So the Office of Management and Budget is really what sets policy across the federal government. So you're talking like anything that the OMB, Office of Management and Budget, does impacts every federal science agency. We're talking NSF, NIH, so National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, the Center for Disease Control, the Federal Food and Drug Administration, and also Department of Education, and every government entity OMB impacts. So when we're talking about this, we're not talking about just science grant making. We're pretty much talking about all grant making with a particularly important impact on science, and the one that I know best. So it is a proposed rule that they've released for public comment that seeks to modify the government-wide grants guidance, which really is a continuation of things that the administration has been doing since last year. So last year, there was an executive order that came out on improving oversight of federal grant making. And these activities and changes are discussed under kind of the language of intending to promote transparency, stewardship, reduce waste, fraud, and abuse. But what we find is they do pretty much everything opposite of that. When you think about applying for a grant, if you're in the sciences, you know it as this competitive process where you write these long narratives, justify what methods you're going to use. Then you go through a rigorous system of review by other scientists to find the most rigorous science that will produce the best results. And ideally, from a government perspective, the greatest return on investment for the public in the long term. That return on investment, we know from basic research, might be years in the future, but the intent is to fund the most competitive science. These rules essentially add in new layers that make it opaque and politicize the process in a way that it hasn't been really before. And the way that it is written opens up a lot of really non-merit-based funding decisions. It really changes the dynamics that we're seeing. So to put it succinctly, under this new rule, the president, political appointees will have this unprecedented ability to choose the winners and the losers in this, what was a merit-based system, giving preferences to things that align with their political perspectives and less to do with the science. So that is the big thing. There's also concerns. There's language in there around essentially allowing for cancellation or suspension of grants with no justification, warning, appeal. It allows the government to unilaterally change the agreed to terms and conditions of any grant award.
Yeah, and grants are usually awarded given like a 3-year or 5-year time span. So usually the way that scientists are operating is expecting, as long as they're completing the goals of the grant, that money should keep coming so they can plan for long-term experiments, right?
Yes, exactly. So like when you think about grant funding used in clinical trials, right, or you get the funding in that allows you to open up a clinical trial. It allows you to recruit patients to participate, to buy the materials that you use, to work with the hospital. And now imagine, you've started enrolling patients, you've given them the first dose, and the government decides, doesn't need a justification, just decides we're going to pause your funding. You miss time points, essentially, and a time point being like the time you're supposed to collect the data to tell you whether or not the drug's working. You don't collect that data.
Wow.
Then that entire study goes out the window. So it's not that like science is one of those things that cannot be paused in the middle of it, because we spend a lot of time thinking about when you need to collect the data to have the best understanding of the way things work. And if you can't collect that data because you don't have the money to buy the materials you need to hire the worker, that really just ruins all the experiments midway. So when we talk about waste and abuse, to me, that's the thing, is that this is creating a grant space that is volatile, it's uncertain, and can lead to a lot more waste because you have people who are in office and political appointees who don't understand these dynamics within science, just turning off the access to funds at any point if they want to.
And you mentioned this clinical trial, so that would affect the people who are participating in those trials as well, because people don't just enroll in clinical trials for the sake of science. Sometimes they're looking for a potential drug or treatment that we don't know will work for them, but is something that they're hoping could be a cure that hasn't been found yet, or a treatment that hasn't been found yet. So it affects those participants as well, right?
Oh, clinical trials are life and death for some people, for some contexts, especially when we're talking about people who are seriously ill and they do not have this kind of standard of care. It is threatening their access to potentially life-saving medications. And we also know, I had mentioned that this is something that the administration has kind of been testing through its executive authority, but hadn't codified it. So this is putting what they were doing into law in a way that is really hard to undo. Over the last year, there was a point where they tried to cancel, I think it was about $2 billion worth of grants from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. That funding supported community health centers for things like naloxone.
Wow.
And for people who don't know about naloxone, that's a life-saving medication that's used during opioid overdoses.
Yeah, saves people's lives.
That's not science, but that's the example of someone decided, and the reason why they put it on hold was there was a decision that funding was not aligned with administration priorities. That's what was cited as the justification for canceling those grants. There was such a large public outcry. That decision was reversed within 24 hours. But if that doesn't happen, there's a lot of things that are incredibly important that people don't know get canceled. There's not always going to be that public outcry to overturn a bad decision. And then you have really serious consequences for communities.
So you said at the beginning that this is a proposed rule, so it hasn't gone into effect, and the government is seeking comments from everybody, right? So what does that mean? How do people convey their thoughts about this proposed rule, if they agree with it or if they disagree with it, or whatever their thinking is?
So this is actually one of the little-known beauties of the federal government, is that any significant role has to go through a public comment period. And when you talk about democracy and participation, this is actually one of those chances where you can submit your voice to be heard. So this was a proposed rule. It's open for public comment. It's open until July 13th.
I've heard that's pretty abbreviated compared to most situations.
It's a shorter timeline. There's actually an active effort to try and get them to lengthen the timeline. They are trying to move this rule as quickly as possible, but the time is now to submit a comment, and then the government reviews those comments. And, there's not necessarily a lot of, to be frank, hope that it will change the minds of the people within the administration. Writing in to say your concerns about how it impacts you is still really important, and particularly important because it's a thing that Congress will pay attention to. The number of responses, the stories that are told. You can actually even just send what you write in for the rule to your member of Congress. It's about telling these stories and having as many of them as possible. And it's that groundswell, like that example that I gave, like, sometimes there is a response, but you need to show your level of concern. So submitting a comment is important. I'll also point people to resources like the Union of Concerned Scientists actually has like guidance for how to submit a rule. Don't be intimidated if it's your first time. Also, reach out to your member of Congress, like ask them to conduct oversight hearings, talk about the potential impacts, request a formal report from something called like the Government Accountability Office. Like you can actually put pressure on your member of Congress to do something about it. And they need to hear from you to know that that's important. And science is one of those areas that we've actually seen Congress push back a little bit. A lot of the proposed budgets coming out of the administration have slashed funding for federal science. And then when the budget has been passed, that funding has been put back in by members of Congress, especially for things like the National Institutes of Health. So there is some hope that if enough people speak out, that Congress will take action.
Yeah, that's great to hear. I'll link some of those resources that you mentioned.
Wonderful.
I went to a seminar yesterday from Research America that went through some of the tips for putting in your comment. Like one that I can say off the top of my head was don't copy paste something that you've been given. You really want to tell your story or your individual impact, because if you copy paste a comment and there's no difference from someone else's, even if there's 20 of them, that will be counted as just one, for example. But I don't think it's terribly difficult. There's just a couple things to keep in mind when you do it.
And the thing, I 100% agree with that. And Research America is another great resource for things like this, especially if you're a scientist. It's these stories of how things work on the ground. Don't assume that your members of Congress know. And if you know things like that this rule will create the ability for your experiments to get shut down at any point, tell that story about what that means, what your science does, the potential public impact of your science, and then like what it means if it was to be turned off in the middle of it. Your concerns about the politicization of the scientific process and what that means for the rigor of your work, and tell those stories in detail. Don't assume that the people who are making these rules and who are working on policy understand what it looks like on the ground. Having been in both places, you realize that there's just not a lot of visibility. You don't have to be overly technical. Just tell your story.
That's great advice. Yeah, don't assume that they know. Don't assume that they're automatically against you, because I think this hasn't necessarily always been a party line issue, right?
No, it's trust in science, and the belief that science benefits all people is still like, the public still values science, and it's still an incredibly bipartisan issue. So don't assume that there's a political element to everybody who's looking at this topic. And I think that is it's a great way to approach it. And just to reiterate for you and your listeners that like this pushback to the rule is not, to your point, it's not about politics. Think about our government works because these processes are rigorous, that people know what the government is going to do is a reliable partner. And the more we insert political actors into it, uncertainty, opaque guidance, the less likely people are to participate. Like if your university thinks that it doesn't have a shot at funding because they have, a liberal arts program that is offensive to the priorities of the administration, any administration, this administration, future administrations, they might not suggest you apply for funding, which means the most competitive research won't actually even compete to begin with because of reasons that have nothing to do with their proposal. And I just want to make that point that this is something that, like, once you open the holes in these systems, they're hard to get rid of. This isn't about pushing back against what this administration is doing. It's about creating a system that'll work for the long term and not creating like vulnerabilities that pretty much anybody could exploit down the road.
Yeah, and some vagueness in language, I know, in the rule that could just be interpreted all different ways by this administration, any future administration. It's just too open to toying around with depending on whoever is in power versus a science-driven, merit-driven, competitive process that is based off of, like what you said, return on investment and public health and what the people actually care about.
A competitive process is what's in the public's best interest. It's the best use of their resources. It will produce the best outcomes from them, and that's what we should be pushing for.
And with that, our first edition of Pointless Policies is over. I've included the resources we discussed in the show notes. The proposed rule is over 400 pages long, so we definitely didn't get into everything in it here. But it's linked for you to peruse at your pleasure. For scientists, there's this cute little quiz you can take to help you figure out how the proposed changes directly affect you, to help you with writing your comment. For non-scientists, take a look at the National Council of Nonprofits breakdown. For example, you can write about how the ability to terminate or suspend funds would affect you or your loved one's access to emerging treatments through clinical trials. You've got until July 13th. Extra special thanks to today's guest, Dr. Erica Kimmerling. I'll be back soon with some creepy crawly friends. Thanks so much for listening. I'm Houda Khaled, and this was Frivolous Science.